There's a sound stone makes when it grows. Nobody living has heard it. But the Lakota say it happened, and it happened here. It happened in the country of grass, on the western edge of what would one day be called Wyoming, in a place where the prairie flattens itself like a sleeping animal, and then, for no reason a rider can see, breaks open. Something rises from the ground. 700 feet of gray stone, vertical, fluted, its sides carved into columns the width of a man's shoulders and the height of a cathedral. Its top flat, its base circled by broken talus. If you stand at the foot of it just before dawn in late June, the mist off the Belle Fourche River comes up through the pines and touches the base of the rock. And for a few minutes, the top is gone. Just gone. There is only the sound of the wind through the ponderosa and the small motion of cloth in the branches. Prayer bundles, red, blue, yellow, white. Placed there by Lakota, by Cheyenne, by Kiowa, by Arapaho, by Crow, by Shoshone. Some are new. Some have been there long enough that the color has bled out of them and only the shape of the knot remains. The white world calls this place Devil's Tower. The people who have been coming here for at least 3,000 years call it something else. And the question that no tourist pamphlet has ever answered, the question that even the ranger station will not answer directly, is a simple one. If the tower is a lodge, whose lodge is it? What did the Lakota say was living inside? Answer that, and the rock is no longer strange. Answer that, and the name changes. We need to go back. Not to the year the rock was named, but before the rock had that name. Before there were surveyors on the Belle Fourche. Before there was a Belle Fourche, the French river name, layered over the older names. Before there was a horse on this continent. Long, long before that. Because there is a way to see this place, and there is a way to see it right. The Lakota word is matotipila. In English, matotipila. Bear Lodge. The name is old, and even the linguists who work with the language argue about the shade of it. In one reading, tipila is a diminutive of tipai, a house, a dwelling. In another reading, the suffix carries something warmer, closer to affection, closer to reverence for a living thing. So the fuller sense of the word is not just the bear's house, it is closer to the bear's home, the place where bears should live. A living place. A home. There's a second Lakota name, less commonly heard. Ptehegi, Gray Horn Butte. The horn of the great buffalo. The rock read as an anatomy, as if the whole prairie were the body of an animal, and this was one of its horns. Both names existed. Both names still exist. Neither name has anything at all to do with the devil. To understand what the Lakota said was inside the rock, you have to understand a boy named Wikapi Hinpaya. The name means fallen star. And this is a documented tradition, carried by Lakota elders and set down in the 20th century by scholars including the Oglala historian James LaPointe, and repeated in our own time by Craig Howe, director of the Center for American Indian Research and Native Studies. The version I will tell you is his. Long ago, before the tower was there, a boy from the star country fell to earth. The way the story reaches us, his mother, a woman from the sky people, came down first, and by the time the Lakota found her, she was dead. There was a baby beside her. An older woman of the Tiospaye, the extended family, took the baby in and raised him. They gave him the name of the thing they had seen. Wikapi Hinpaya, fallen star. He was, as the elders say, peculiar from the start. He grew fast. In one of the people's years, he aged 4. In 4 of the people's years, he was a young man. He did things the people had not seen done before. He protected. He healed. He knew things that could not be taught. When he was still very young, by any measure a Lakota grandmother would use, he told the people he was going home. Home to the star country, to his father's people. But he promised he would remember them. He promised that if there was ever a moment of terrible danger, he would come. Then he went into the sky. Years passed. One afternoon, in the country west of the Black Hills, a group of Lakota were traveling. The men were hunting. The women were setting up lodges. The children played, as children do, and a group of the girls wandered farther from camp than they should have. In some tellings there are 7 of them. In some tellings there are more. In every telling, at some point during their play, they realize they are being watched. A bear, not an ordinary bear. Something larger. Something with intent. They ran, but the bear was already between them and the camp. There was nowhere to go. There was, in the middle of the grass, a small rise of earth, a hill barely worth the name. They climbed onto it and closed their eyes because they did not want to see the thing that was about to happen. And then, out of the sky, they heard a voice. A voice they didn't recognize, but that spoke to them the way a relative speaks. It said, "Stand where you are," and it said, "Do not be afraid." The voice was Fallen Star. He had remembered. The story says that the small rise of earth beneath the girls began to grow, not fast at first, then faster. It rose and it kept rising, and the bear rushed the base of it and clawed at the sides, trying to get to what was on top. The claws went into the stone. As the mound rose, chunks of the rock split off in long vertical shards, and the shards fell on the bear, and the bear died. And the mound kept rising. The girls were carried up with it until the tops of the ponderosas were far below them, and the prairie was a green cloth, and they were on top of a tower of stone taller than anything anyone had ever seen. They were saved. They were also stranded. The story does not skip this problem. Wikapi Hinpaya spoke again, and he asked each girl to name her favorite bird. Each girl gave a different bird, and one at a time flocks came, and each flock lifted its girl by the wrists and the ankles and carried her gently back down to the prairie and back to her people. That is what the elders say. That is the story the Lakota were telling long before there was anyone here to write it down. And that is what they said was inside the rock. Not a demon, not bad spirits, a memory. The memory of a bear's fury, the memory of a promise kept, the memory of 7 relatives who almost weren't relatives anymore and are now the reason the stone exists at all. There is one more thing about this story that is easy to miss. The Lakota have a constellation named Mato Tipala, Bear Lodge, same name as the rock. And when the elders point to it in the sky, they are pointing to what most non-Lakota people call the constellation Gemini. Different star pattern, same name. In the summer, when the ceremonies happen, the Sky Lodge and the Ground Lodge are visible in a specific alignment, as if the two were reflections of each other. Sky above, stone below, same word. This is not decoration. It is a system of knowledge, worked out over so many generations that nobody remembers who first noticed it. Now, the Lakota are not the only ones with stories about this place. The Cheyenne call it Na Kavea, Bear's Lodge. Again, in one Cheyenne telling, remembered by Wooden Leg, a northern Cheyenne who traveled through the area with an older man sometime around 1866 to 1868, the story is different in its details, but the shape is the same. A group of children pursued by a bear, a prayer to the great medicine, Maheo, a rock rising to save them. In another Cheyenne version, 7 brothers rescue the wife of the oldest brother from a bear who has taken her, and the killing arrow, shot through the underside of the bear's foot, is the last arrow, and it never comes back down. The Kiowa call it Tsoai, rock tree. And the Kiowa story is the one that many people outside of the tribes know best, because a Kiowa writer named Navarre Scott Momaday, born in 1934, wrote it down and won the Pulitzer Prize. In Momaday's grandmother Aho's telling, there were 8 children playing near the rock, 7 sisters and 1 brother. The boy was suddenly, without warning, changed. His fingers grew claws. His skin grew fur. He was a bear now. The sisters ran. They came to the stump of a great tree, and the tree spoke to them and told them to climb. And as they climbed, the tree rose upward into the sky. The bear scored the bark all around with his claws, and the 7 sisters were borne up so high that they passed out of the prairie world entirely and became the stars of the Big Dipper. That is a documented tradition. Momaday's own Kiowa name is Tsoai Tali, rock tree boy. He was carried as an infant to the base of the tower and given that name so that the rock would know him. He is still living. He was born in the same summer his parents took him there. And even now in his 9th decade, when he speaks of it, he does not speak the way we speak of a place we have visited. He speaks the way we might speak of a member of a family. The crow, whose old name for the tower is Debicha Aso, Bear's House, kept a related story. 2 little girls playing near a place already called Bear's House. A bear that saw them. Great Spirit intervening. The rock rising. The claw marks. And little dream houses, small enough for one person to lie down in with the head to the east and the feet to the west, built at the base of the rock so a crow young man or woman could fast, could dream, could receive whatever the rock and the country and the ancestors chose to give. The Arapaho name is Wooks Ninon, Bear's Teepee. In the Arapaho story that survives, it is a girl who is changed into a bear, and she comes back to attack the family that raised her, and it is the claws of that sister bear on the sides of the tower that leaves those long vertical scratches. A darker story, a story about family and what family can become. All of these are documented in ethnographic accounts, some collected by Dick Stone and Shirley Rathbun in the 1930s, others gathered more carefully by the ethnographers Jeffrey Hansen and Sally Chirinos in a National Park Service assessment published in 1997. 6 major traditions, 6 specific nations, 6 stories, each different, all connected by the same fact. This rock is a home, not a haunt, a home, and it is a place where things are done. The sun dance, Wiwanyang Wachipe in Lakota, the most important ceremony of the Lakota year. It is held around the summer solstice in late June when the Lakota constellation Mato Tipila is overhead at noon, invisible against the day. That is not a coincidence. That is why June is the month. The ceremony is one of fasting, of sacrifice, of the renewal of the community through the willingness of individual people to give something of themselves. It has been happening at Matotipila for a very, very long time. The archaeologist working the record says the ancestors of the Lakota were in this country by roughly 1,000 years ago, and the ancestors of the Shoshone by the 1500s, and other affiliated peoples earlier still. There are vision quests, humble at Kayapi. A young person, usually alone, going up onto the hillside above the tower for several days without food and without water, waiting for something, waiting for a sight, a name, a purpose, a relationship with a being who might choose to make itself known. The crow dream houses I mentioned are used for this. So are natural hollows in the rock, cracks in the base, places among the columns. There are sweat lodges, Inupai, small, low, dark, steam and prayer. And there are the bundles I mentioned at the start, the cloth. Anyone who has walked the paved trail that circles the base of Devil's Tower National Monument has seen them, though most people don't understand what they are looking at. Each one is a prayer. Each one has a person's request tied inside. Some are offerings for someone alive who needs help. Some are for someone recently lost. Some are for a country. Some are for a child. They are still being tied. They were being tied 1,000 years ago. They are being tied this June, right now, as I am telling you this. The people who tie them have not gone anywhere. Which brings us to the other side of the story. Because everything I have told you so far, all of that, was true in this country before the first non-native person ever stood at the base of the rock and looked up. And when the non-natives came, they saw the same rock, and they did not see the same thing. The first record we have of Europeans anywhere near the Black Hills comes from 1743, from an expedition by the La Vérendrye brothers, 2 French Canadians who had come up the Missouri River from the north. They saw the Black Hills. They didn't specifically describe the tower. It is possible they never saw it. It is also possible they saw it, thought about writing about it, and did not. For over a century after that, there is no confirmed white visitor to the base of Matotipila. Fur trappers may have been there. A map by a trapper named John Dougherty, drawn sometime around 1814, may include the tower, though the map's authorship and date are disputed. The first documented sighting by non-natives is from 1859. A scouting party attached to Captain William Reynolds' expedition to the Yellowstone region came into the country west of the Black Hills. The Reynolds expedition's cartographer, a man named G.K. Warren, produced a map. On that map, the rock is labeled with the words Matotipi, or Bear's Lodge. Matotipi. That is a rough phonetic English rendering of the Lakota. Warren's report noted encountering a group of Lakotas in the western Black Hills. He didn't need to invent a name for the rock. The Lakota had one. He wrote it down. He did that correctly. The second documented white expedition is from 1874. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. His purpose was, on paper, reconnaissance. His purpose, in fact, was to confirm rumors of gold in the Black Hills, which was territory guaranteed by treaty, by the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, to the Great Sioux Nation, in perpetuity. Custer confirmed the rumors. His expedition maps used the name Bear Lodge. He also, by breaking the treaty in every practical sense of the word, set into motion the sequence of events that led to the Great Sioux War of 1876, and to his own death at the Greasy Grass, or what the American press would call Little Bighorn, 2 summers later. But before Custer died, one more expedition went out. This one is the one that matters. In the spring and summer of 1875, a scientific expedition led by the geologist Walter P. Jenney was sent into the Black Hills. Its purpose was to determine, once and for all, whether the gold Custer had reported was real, and how much of it there was. The military escort for that expedition was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Irving Dodge. Dodge was 58 years old. He was a career officer of the United States Army. He kept a very detailed journal. Later in the field, he called this trip the most delightful summer of his life. Dodge's expedition rode north out of Cheyenne, Wyoming, with 452 men, wagons, animals, and a guide who called himself California Joe. There was a stowaway named Martha Jane Kennery, who would later become better known by another name, Calamity Jane. There were scientists, there were soldiers, there were miners tagging along. There was a translator. His name has come down to us as Romeo. He was, according to the expedition records, part Cheyenne and part Mexican. His actual command of the Lakota language, and of Plains Indian culture generally, is not documented. There is no way to check what he actually knew. They arrived at the base of Bear Lodge in the second half of the summer. And here is where the fabrication begins. Dodge, in his field journal, wrote a specific sentence. It has been transcribed by the historian Wayne R. Kymie, who edited Dodge's journals for the University of Oklahoma Press in 1996. The sentence, later slightly revised by Dodge for publication, reads like this. The Indians call this place a Bad God's Tower, a name adopted with proper modification by our surveyors. Bad God's Tower. There is no evidence in any native tradition ever recorded that any Northern Plains people called this rock Bad God's Tower. None. Not one. Every documented native name for the site, every single one collected from every nation with a documented tie to the rock, comes from a family of words related to bears. Bear Lodge, Bear's House, Bear's Teepee, Home of the Bear, Bear's Lair. The Greyhorn Butte version in Lakota is the one exception, and Greyhorn Butte is not a bad god either. It is an anatomy of the world. So what happened? There are two theories. The people who study this professionally have argued both. The first is a linguistic accident. In Lakota, there is a word Wakansika, two words really. Wakan meaning holy, sacred, mysterious, powerful. Sika meaning bad, in the sense of harmful or dangerous. Wakan Sisa together means, roughly, a malevolent spirit. Now, in the same language, there is another word, Wahanksika, that means the black bear. Wakansika, Wahanksika. A person who did not know the language well, hearing these words spoken in the field, could mishear them, could confuse them, could ask what a place was called. Hear a word that sounded like Wahanksika, mistake it for Wakansika, and translate what he thought he had heard. The other theory is that Dodge, or Romeo, or both of them together, knew perfectly well what the place was called and chose a name that better suited a rock that would soon be inside the United States, and not inside the Great Sioux Reservation. This is not a wild theory. Dodge was not a neutral observer. In the same period, in a book he later published called Our Wild Indians, he described native peoples in terms that were, to use the historian's polite phrasing, decidedly elitist and negative. His summary of one passage on native character reads, in short, he has the ordinary good and bad qualities of the mere animal, modified to some extent by reason. That is a sentence Dodge wrote and Dodge published. And the same Dodge, 8 years before he ever saw the tower, had said something else. He had said, and I want you to hold this sentence in your mind, every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. You can decide which theory fits better, bad translation, bad faith, or most likely some combination of both, in a summer when the Black Hills were about to be taken and the men taking them were writing the names down. What is documented is that Dodge himself, earlier in the same journal, had referred to the rock as Bear Lodge. He switched. Partway through the summer, in his own writing, he changed the name of a place. Then he went home to the east, and in 1876, 1 year after the expedition, he published a book. The book is called The Black Hills. In it, the phrase Devil's Tower appears in print, in a mass market publication for the first time. That is the moment, that sentence. That paragraph in a book by a colonel who had ridden through the country, that is where the name comes from. Nothing older than that, nothing native about it, not a translation, not a legend. A name a colonel invented in a book, at the end of a summer he called delightful, in a season that ended with the war he was about to help fight. For a while, both names kept living together. Government geologists mostly used Bear Lodge. The Warren map kept its label. The names in Custer's older records kept theirs. But books are more portable than maps, and books are read by more people, and Dodge's book got read. As American miners and ranchers and timber cutters and settlers came into the country, in violation of the 1868 treaty, they read Dodge. They said Devil's Tower. Their children said Devil's Tower. Their newspapers said Devil's Tower. By the 1890s, when the federal government first started thinking about protecting the site, the native name was gone from the public record. Nobody in Washington was calling it Bear Lodge anymore. Not in the papers on their desks, not in the maps on their walls. In 1892, the land was set aside as a federal forest reserve. In 1893, on the 4th of July, two local ranchers named William Rogers and Willard Ripley did something no native tradition has any record of anyone doing. They climbed the rock. They did it by driving wooden stakes into a vertical crack in the southeast face over the course of several weeks and building a 350-foot ladder into the side of Matotipala. On Independence Day, 1,900 spectators came out to the base to watch. Rogers went up the ladder. When he got to the top, he unfurled an American flag. Think about that image for a second. On the 4th of July, in a country where the Treaty of 1868 had, 7 years earlier, guaranteed this land in perpetuity to the Lakota, a homesteader climbed the sacred rock and put a flag on it, and 1,900 people applauded. The people who built the ladder made money from tourists coming to see the ladder. Some of the stakes are still there. The base of the ladder is visible from the paved trail today, if you know where to look. It is the earliest man-made feature on the rock, and it was built to sell tickets. In September of 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt used the Antiquities Act, signed into law only 3 months earlier, to designate the site the first national monument in the history of the United States. He kept the wrong name, Devil's Tower National Monument. There is no evidence that any Northern Plains tribe was consulted about this designation. There is no evidence that anyone in Washington asked what the Lakota called the place. There is no evidence that anyone tried to find out. If you want to know when the fabrication became official, that is the year, 1906. And then something else happened. I want to be very careful here, because this is where the sacred rock became a product, and where the product became a story, and where the story became something the tribes had no hand in at all. The 1910s and 20s brought railroads within reach of the tower. The 1930s brought the Civilian Conservation Corps, which built the roads and the visitor center and the paved trail. In 1941, a parachutist named George Hopkins jumped out of an airplane onto the top of the tower as a publicity stunt and got stranded up there for 6 days and had to be rescued by climbers. The newspapers loved it. The New York Times ran the story on the 7th of October. The parachute company got exactly the coverage it had paid for. Hopkins, when he came down, told a reporter he would rather have gone back up than face the crowd. Every one of these stories, the ladder, the flag, the parachutist, was told and retold in the American press with the name Devil's Tower. Never with the name Bear Lodge. Never with the name Matotipola. The name Matotipola does not appear in a single mass-market American publication from the 1910s to the 1960s, as far as I have been able to find. There are ethnographic reports and academic dissertations. Nothing in the popular press. The native name was, in effect, deleted. And then, in 1977, a filmmaker named Steven Spielberg released a movie called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. If you have seen the movie, you know how it ends. If you haven't, I'll tell you. The climactic scene of the film takes place at the base of the rock. The characters in the film experience visions of a strange, striated, flat-topped mountain. They obsess over it. They sculpt it out of mashed potatoes. They travel across the country to find it. And when they get there, at night, aliens land. A mothership descends. There's a moment of communication, and the human protagonist walks up the ramp and leaves this world behind. The film was a phenomenon. It was nominated for 8 Academy Awards. It made Devil's Tower, the name, world famous, and it welded the site in the imagination of hundreds of millions of people to something it had never been. Not a lodge, not a home, a landing pad, a door to somewhere else, a place where beings from a very great distance would come to make first contact with humanity. Nothing, in any Northern Plains tradition, and I mean nothing, has ever placed a landing of star beings at Matotipola. The fallen star story is close, at first glance, but it is a story about a boy from the sky world who was already among the Lakota, who saved a small group of relatives and who returned to the sky. It is not a story about visitors from beyond arriving on the top of a rock in Wyoming. That reading is a projection. It is the movie's frame laid on top of a much older story. Craig Howe, the Lakota historian who tells the Wikapi Hinpaya story, has said as much. The star relative in the Lakota tradition is not a UFO. He is family. And the tower is where his kindness for that family became stone. But the movie stuck. It stuck harder than the ladder, harder than the flag, harder than the parachutist. It stuck harder than the name. If you talk to a park ranger at the base of Matotipola today, and if you spend any time in the visitor center, you will find that a great many of the annual 500,000 visitors to that site are there because of the movie. They come in some real sense to see the alien rock. They leave, sometimes, having glimpsed the prayer bundles in the trees, and they wonder what those are. Sometimes they ask. Sometimes they don't. The Lakota, of course, are still there. So are the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, the Crow, and the Shoshone, along with about 20 more nations, 26 by the current count of the National Park Service, who continue to hold ceremonies at the tower. The Sundance still happens in June. The Vision Quests still happen. The Sweat Lodges still happen. The bundles are still tied. In 1995, after decades of increasing conflict between rock climbers and native people trying to worship at the base of the tower, the National Park Service put in place a voluntary closure of the rock to climbing during the month of June, the month of the solstice, the month of the sun dance, the month when the Lakota constellation Matotipola is overhead at midday. The closure was not a ban, it was a request. Climbers were asked to stay off the rock during June out of respect. Most climbers said yes. Compliance in the first year was over 80%. Then a group of commercial climbing guides sued. The case was called Bear Lodge Multiple Use Association v. Babbitt. The guides argued that the voluntary closure was an unconstitutional endorsement of native religion by the federal government. In 1998, a federal district court judge, William Downs, ruled against them and upheld the voluntary closure. In 1999, the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals confirmed the ruling. Since then, the voluntary June closure has been in place. Compliance has fallen in some recent years. Some climbers still go up in June. In 2005, a proposal was made to add a second official name to the site, Bear Lodge National Historic Landmark. 2 names, one for what the government had done, one for what the tribes had said. The proposal did not require Congress to remove the name Devil's Tower. It only added Bear Lodge alongside it. It went to the United States Board on Geographic Names. It was blocked. The person who blocked it was a Wyoming congresswoman named Barbara Cuban. She wrote formally in opposition. Her stated reason was economic. She argued, and I quote from her stated public position, that a name change would harm the tourist trade and bring uncertainty and confusion to a well-established business community. I want you to sit with that reasoning for a moment. The argument was not that the tribes were wrong. The argument was not that the name Devil's Tower was the older name, or the truer name, or the more accurate name. The argument was that the wrong name had, over the course of a century, become good for business. That changing it would cost money. That the price of correcting the record was too high. The proposal to add Bear Lodge did not pass. It still hasn't. The site is still on every federal document called Devil's Tower. Only Devil's Tower. Now, I want to be very, very clear about something. Everything I have told you tonight, everything, has been marked as one of three things: the Fallen Star story, the Kiowa Big Dipper story, the Cheyenne Nakovia story, the Crow Dream Houses, the Arapaho Bear Sisters story, and the Sundance ceremony are all documented traditions. They come from the nations themselves, recorded across a range of sources, from the writings of James LaPointe to the memoir of N. Scott Momaday to the ethnographic assessments of Hansen and Chirinos. The Dodge Journal, the Warren Map, the 1868 Treaty, the Custer Expedition, the Rogers Ladder, the Roosevelt Monument, the Hopkins Parachute, the Spielberg film, the Cuban Objection, all of these are documented events. They are in the public record. They are datable. They happened. And the invention, the thing that was fabricated by non-natives and attributed first tacitly and then loudly to the tribes, is the name itself, Devil's Tower, Bad God's Tower. That name is not older than 1875. That name has no root in any native oral tradition. It came from a translator whose competence is not documented, working for a colonel whose contempt for native peoples is documented, in the summer that the Black Hills were being taken. Everything the tourism industry, the Hollywood industry, and 150 years of American popular culture have built on top of that name. The ghost stories, the demonic imagery, the alien landing pad, the horror movie references, all of that was built on a mistranslation or a lie or some blend of the two. It was not built on a native tradition. There is no native tradition of the tower being an evil place. There has never been one. That should matter. The Lakota word Matotipila still exists. The Cheyenne word Nakovia still exists. The Kiowa word Tsoi still exists. So does the Kiowa poet who was named after the rock, Tsoi N. Scott Momaday, 91 years old this year, and still, when he speaks of the place, softening his voice. So do the Sun Dancers, some of whom are the grandchildren of the Sun Dancers who came to Matotipila when Devil's Tower was on the maps and the Sioux Wars were still recent memory. So do the bundles in the branches. So do the small dream houses of the Crow, worn now into the shape of the ground itself. So does the constellation, wheeling overhead every June. And so does the rock. 265 meters of gray stone, phonolite porphyry, the largest example of columnar jointing on Earth, formed about 40 million years ago when magma pushed up into the sedimentary layers and cooled slowly enough for the columns to crystallize. That is the geologist's story, and the geologist's story is not in conflict with any of the other stories. The Lakota do not say the rock is not made of stone. The Kiowa do not say the columns are not columns. The stories the nations tell are not stories about how the rock is made of some other material. They are stories about what happened at the rock, and what the rock is for, and who is welcome there, which is the answer to the question I asked at the beginning. What did the Lakota say was living inside Devil's Tower? The answer is that they didn't call it Devil's Tower, and they didn't think of the inside of it as a place where anything hostile lived. What they said was, this is a lodge, which means a home, which means the being inside it is a relative, a large one, an old one who once, in one telling, chased 7 girls across a prairie in a rage, one who died in that telling under the rocks that fell from the growing stone, and one who is buried. If you follow the story all the way to its floor, beneath the talus at the base of the tower, the being inside the lodge is the bear, not a demon, not a bad god, not an alien, a bear. And around the bear, if you keep listening, are the girls. The 7 who are now the constellation the Kiowa call the Sisters, and the astronomers call the Big Dipper in one version. The ones who were carried down by the birds in another, the Sun Dancers who still come every June, the grandchildren of the Sun Dancers, the elders who taught the grandchildren, the name in every language that mattered before 1875, and in every language that still matters, in the mouths of the Lakota grandmothers who are still speaking it tonight. And that is what is inside the rock. Not a devil, a family. The night I finished the research for this story, I went back and looked at photographs of the tower again. Photographs from the 1890s, when the rock was already Devil's Tower on the maps, but the ladder was still fresh, and photographs from the 1970s during the filming of the Spielberg picture, when the top of the tower was lit for cameras, and there was a mothership hanging over it that only existed on celluloid, and photographs from last summer, from June, of a group of Lakota men and women walking around the base with tobacco in their hands and prayer bundles in their arms. What surprised me, looking at all of the photographs together, was how the rock in all of them was the same rock. The name changed. The intent of the people looking at it changed. The rock did not change. There's a sound stone makes when it grows. That is how I started. And that sentence is not from any native tradition. That sentence I wrote, it is a way of pointing at what the Lakota were pointing at when they told the Wikapi Hinpaya story. The idea that the ground, at a moment of real danger when a child is about to be lost, can decide to rise, can decide to become a shelter, can decide, without being asked in any human language, to lift the small ones out of reach. That is the story the Lakota were telling and are still telling about this rock. That is what they said was inside it, not something to be feared, something to be thanked. The name on the government maps is still Devil's Tower. Congress has never voted to change it. The Federal Board on Geographic Names has never approved the Bear Lodge Edition. As I record this, the year is 2026, 151 years after Richard Irving Dodge wrote a single wrong sentence in a journal. That single sentence is still on every road sign in northeastern Wyoming, on every brochure at the visitor center, on every t-shirt, in every gas station between Sundance and Hewlett, on every ticket sold at the gate. The nations are still there. The stories are still there. The ceremonies are still there. The rock is still there. And what was inside the rock, before there was a name on the map, is still inside it. It doesn't need our permission to be there. It doesn't need our name for it. It has its own name. 6 of them in 6 languages, all pointing at the same thing. All of them are older than the country I'm speaking in. All of them are, at this moment, more accurate. Bear Lodge, Matotipila, Nakovia, Soai, Dabicha, Asau, Wuxninan. Say any one of those out loud and you have said something that is true. Say the other name, and you have said what a colonel in 1875 wanted a rock in the Black Hills to be called, so that a place that was already someone else's would become easier to take. That is the difference. That is what the difference costs. That is why the tribes are still asking quietly and patiently for the older name to come back. Whether it does or not is up to a Congress and a Board of Geographic Names, and, in the end, up to us. Up to whether, when we say the word for a place, we say what it is or what somebody once wanted it to be. That is a small choice. It is not a difficult one. It costs nothing to make. It never has. There's a sound stone makes when it grows. Nobody living has heard it. But the Lakota say it happened, and it happened here. And what came up out of the ground, on that day the Lakota still remember, is called Bear Lodge. It has always been called Bear Lodge. It is called Bear Lodge tonight, in the language of the people who first stood at the base of it and thanked it for what it did. The name in the government file is not the name of the rock. The rock knows its name. The people who tie the bundles know its name. And now, so do you.